What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because the day I opened my credit report just to check on something small, I realized that the house my parents had bought for my sister was not just theirs, and it sure as hell was not just hers either. My name, my credit, and my insurance were buried in the paperwork, like I was some invisible guarantor they could use whenever they wanted. And the worst part? None of them thought I would ever notice. They assumed I would just keep paying little bills here and there, because that is the role they trained me into since I was a teenager. But I noticed, and that was the moment when the whole script changed. I grew up hearing one line over and over: "We would help you if we could, but money is tight." When I needed braces, I had to pay for them myself once I was old enough to work. When I bought my first car, I covered the down payment and the insurance while still in school. When I went to community college, they offered a pat on the back, not a single check. Meanwhile, my sister Avery somehow got her tuition handled, her car loan co-signed, and eventually, as I learned, an entire house. The story was always the same. I was independent, Avery was fragile, and parents had to step in for her sake. They dressed it up as love, but to me it looked like selective generosity. I just learned to stop expecting. The phone call that triggered everything was casual, like it was no big deal. Mom said, "We just bought Avery a house, and we will need your help with a couple of little things. You know, you're good with accounts. The HOA bill is simple, and we bundled some insurance, so you can just handle the login. It will not cost you anything." I almost laughed, because if there is one thing I have learned, it is that with them, nothing ever really costs them anything. It costs me. I agreed to nothing, but a few hours later an email showed up in my inbox, welcoming me to the homeowner's portal. Not her name, not my parents' names, mine. My stomach dropped. That night, I sat down and pulled my credit report, partly out of dread and partly out of habit, because every time they hand me a favor, it comes with strings I did not agree to. And there it was, insurance policies listed under my profile that I did not recognize. They were tied to an address I had never lived at. It was Avery's new house, sitting there like an anchor chained to me. Somehow my umbrella policy was being used to reduce their premiums, and my clean record was the backbone of their shiny deal. No warning, no permission, no thank you. I did not blow up at anyone. I did something better. I opened my laptop and started cutting every quiet drip they had set up in my life. They were on my family phone plan? Not anymore. By midnight, the lines were separated, and they would have to set up their own accounts. I looked at the streaming bundles that automatically billed me because it's just easier if you pay and we'll send you later. I canceled all of them. I looked at the auto pay for car insurance where my dad had been piggybacking for years, canceled, effective immediately. They had no idea, but I had finally stopped letting them use my wallet like a refill station. By the next morning, the family group chat was buzzing with confusion. Why is Netflix not working? My phone says I need to set up a new account. Did you change something? I ignored it. Silence is powerful when people are used to you fixing everything. But my silence broke when another email landed, this one from the HOA itself, not forwarded from Mom. It said, as primary contact, please confirm the updated coverage for the property on Birch Lane. Primary contact. Me. My name was directly connected to Avery's house in official records, not just in some sloppy family shortcut. They had tied me in so deeply that the system believed I was the owner. I stared at the email for a long time. Anger, betrayal, disbelief, it all hit me at once. But underneath it, there was clarity. This was not an accident. This was not a favor that got out of hand. This was them assuming, once again, that my life and my credit were extensions of theirs, tools they could bend for Avery's comfort. They thought I would either not notice or not fight back. They forgot that I had learned to survive without their help, and that meant I also learned how to protect myself without their permission. I did not reply to the HOA. Not yet. Instead, I saved the email, I made copies, and I tucked them away in a folder labeled Receipts. Because if my name was going to be dragged into their shiny new house, then I was going to make damn sure every step they took left a trail that I could use later. I knew this was just the beginning, and I also knew that they had no idea what was coming. The HOA email was proof, and I realized my name was not just being used casually, it was officially tied to Avery's property. And if they thought I would just ignore that, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The group chat erupted before I had even finished my coffee, because the moment the phone plans split and the entertainment accounts stopped siphoning out of my card, everyone suddenly discovered that the mysterious convenience fairy had retired. And instead of asking me like adults, they framed the question like an accusation, with my mother leading the chorus about how family should help family and my sister chiming in with that sweetly poisonous tone that always sounds like concern until you replay the words and realize it was a shove, not a hug, and I read every message without responding because I knew there was a better language than arguing, and it was called documentation. I opened a fresh folder on my desktop, named it in plain English so I would not forget what it was, and began pulling down statements that spanned years, because I have this unglamorous habit of saving things that other people treat like confetti. And within an hour, I had a neat stack of bank screenshots showing transfers labeled temporary that never got reimbursed, little notes where my mother promised she would square it by Friday and then never mentioned it again, and a string of Zelle payments for electric bills, car premiums, and pharmacy runs that I covered while they posted photos from backyard barbecues captioned with jokes about how blessed we are, and as I scrolled I realized that this was not a handful of favors. This was a system they built on top of me while telling me I was such a strong, independent woman. Since I already had my credit report open from the night before, I took a slower pass and began reading line by line, and there it was again, an old store card I had never used that showed up around the time I was in high school, with the mailing address matching my parents' old house, and the memory came back of a Saturday when my mother had me sign something for the discount, and now I could see the discount was real, but the permission was not, so I did the most boring and powerful thing possible and filed an identity theft affidavit, not because I wanted drama, but because the record should show that I never asked for that account and I never benefited from it. And I placed a fraud alert to force any future lender to call me before anyone tried to staple my name to something shiny again. While I was doing that, Aunt Linda called and, in her practical way, told me she remembered the college bonds Grandpa bought for me when I was little and how my mother had handled them as custodian. Which sounded fine in theory until Aunt Linda mentioned that she had always wondered why those bonds seemed to vanish right around the time Avery got her first car and a remodel started on my parents' kitchen. And I could feel the floor tilt a little because it confirmed what my gut already knew. That money set aside with my name on it had a funny way of becoming general family funds whenever Avery needed a boost, and I was told to be proud of my independence. The family chat kept buzzing, with Avery playing the soft violin about how I was making things harder during a special time and how she wished I could just be happy for her, and instead of replying I sent a single email to everyone. Not a speech, not a threat. Just a short list in clean bullet points with dates, amounts, and descriptions of everything I had paid over the last few years, and I did not garnish it with adjectives or opinions because numbers do not need decoration, and I added one tidy sentence at the top that said I would no longer be responsible for any account or policy I did not own, and that any use of my name or credit going forward without my written consent would trigger a formal report. And then I closed the laptop because silence is a tool and so is a paper trail. By late afternoon, the tone shifted from righteous outrage to awkward negotiation, with my father asking if we could keep the discounts for a little while because the insurance bundle had lowered costs for everyone. And I simply replied that they could keep any discount they qualified for under their own names, which is a long way of saying no, and when my mother tried the guilt approach by reminding me that family is supposed to be one team, I told her that teams require rules, especially the one about not forging signatures, and that ended the call faster than any insult could have, because the word she had been avoiding finally stepped into the room and sat down like a referee. In the quiet that followed, I went back to the HOA email that called me the primary contact, saved a copy to the receipts folder, and set a reminder to circle back, because I wanted to make sure I did not miss a single breadcrumb. Then I took screenshots of the insurance cards that had my policy number next to Avery's address, which felt like someone had taken my driver's license and taped it to her front door without asking me first. And I organized everything by date so I could see the shape of the pattern, how every so-called mix-up flowed in exactly one direction, and the map it drew was a straight line from my steadiness to her comfort. Late that evening, after a few more guilt texts from my mother and one passive comment from Avery about how I should not burn bridges, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I picked up, a professional voice from the lender's escrow department asked me to confirm that the property insurance for the Birch Lane address had been placed under my umbrella policy for a multi-policy discount, and if I intended to keep it that way, because a coverage change request had come through. And if I removed it, the mortgage payment would rise and the account might need to be re-underwritten, and I stood at the window listening to this stranger describe the price of my boundaries like it was a line item on a spreadsheet, and something in me stopped being angry and started being surgical. I thanked the caller, asked for the request in writing, and confirmed my email address, and while they were still speaking I opened the receipts folder and created a new subfolder named with the property address, because if they had used my name to support that house, then my name would also be the lever that freed me from it, and the moment I ended the call, a new message landed in my inbox with the lender's letterhead and a tidy paragraph explaining exactly how the premium and escrow would change once my policy detached, and I read it twice, saved it 3 times, and realized the next move would not be a text or a speech or a family meeting. It would be a single, documented action that pulled my identity out of their structure like a pin from a hinge, and I smiled in that tired, relieved way that comes after you finally see the game board clearly. When my mother called again, I let it go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because the conversation had moved to a place where feelings could not fix anything, and I needed the kind of record that feelings do not produce, and as I set my phone down, the lender email chimed again with a follow-up asking for written confirmation of my decision, and the subject line sat there like a countdown I had started and that only I could stop, and that was the moment when I understood that the discounts they loved so much were about to get very expensive for them and gloriously cheap for me, because all it required was one clear sentence from me and the entire arrangement would shift on its axis. When the call from the escrow department ended, I knew the entire game had changed, because this was no longer about a few bills or an old store card in my credit history. This was about my legal identity being welded into a mortgage that I never signed. And the moment I realized that, my anger shifted into something sharper and colder, because once paperwork is involved, you cannot just shrug and let it slide. You have to choose whether you are complicit or whether you cut yourself free, and I decided that evening that I was finished being the silent safety net that nobody thanked until they needed me again. My parents tried the familiar tactics in the days that followed, calling repeatedly with soft voices, as if using a calmer tone would disguise the fact that they had tied my name to a property I had never even walked into, and Avery, instead of being apologetic, called me dramatic and accused me of wanting to ruin her future because I could not stand to see her happy, which was laughable considering that I had been paying my own way since I was old enough to work while she had been carried on every invisible platform they could build. I listened to her, nodded along, and then opened my email to draft a short and very specific request to my insurance company instructing them to remove all properties that I did not personally own and all drivers who were not part of my household from my umbrella policy. It was not emotional, it was not vindictive, it was factual, and the next day I received a formal letter confirming that the house on Birch Lane was no longer listed under my coverage. That one move sent a ripple through their entire carefully stacked arrangement, because without my umbrella policy discount, the lender had to re-underwrite Avery's insurance, which meant the escrow account no longer balanced, and suddenly the monthly mortgage jumped. And the calls from my parents went from soothing to frantic in less than a week. They begged me to just give it some time so they could figure things out, but I told them in a steady voice that time was exactly what I had been giving them for years, and that I was done extending credit in any form, whether financial or emotional. What really cracked the narrative wide open was when Aunt Linda dug into her old files and found deposit slips from years back, slips written in Grandpa's careful handwriting with my name in the memo line, clearly intended for my education or my start in life. Yet the withdrawals showed Carol signing them out as custodian when I was still a minor, and the dates lined up almost perfectly with the months when Avery bought her first car and when the family did a big remodel of the kitchen. It was not technically illegal, but it was ugly, and it told the story that I had always felt but could never prove. That money set aside for me somehow always turned into money for them, and the explanation was always that Avery needed it more. I decided that if they wanted to treat me like a resource, then I would treat our relationship like a business, so I pulled out the old invoices for the branding and web setup I had done for Avery's little business that she ran out of the new house. Work I had done as a favor because family is supposed to help family, and I turned those invoices into a clean formal claim. When she ignored it, I filed in small claims court, attaching the receipts and the hours, because if she wanted to live in a house bought with my identity, she could also learn what it felt like to be billed properly for services rendered. To add weight, I quietly redirected the domain name I had purchased for her business back into my own account, which meant her emails bounced and her online booking system froze, and within 24 hours she was calling me in a panic begging me to undo it. I told her calmly that the moment she paid what she owed, plus the filing fees, the domain would be hers again, and until then, it would sit quietly on my desk, costing me nothing and costing her everything, and when she tried to call me cruel, I reminded her that cruelty is when someone forges a signature, not when someone enforces a contract. She hung up on me, and I went back to making dinner with the kind of steady hands that come only when you finally know you have leverage instead of excuses. A few days later, the rail bomb dropped into my inbox. It was a scanned deed addendum, attached by mistake from someone in the lender's compliance department, and right there in black and white was my name listed as the primary named insured on the proof of insurance binder. At the bottom was a signature that was supposed to be mine, except I had never held that pen, never been in that office, never signed a single thing for that property. My pulse slowed, not sped, because in that moment I understood the scale. This was not sloppy paperwork. This was forgery, and forgery is a line you cannot step back from with apologies or tears. I sat with it, breathing evenly, and realized that all the years of being the overlooked one, the independent one, the one who didn't need as much, had finally built up to this one sharp moment where I could choose to keep being their silent asset, or I could pull the pin and let the entire structure fall, and the only person who could make that call was me. I closed the document, saved it to the receipts folder, and whispered to myself that the game was finally mine, because once you have evidence like that, you are not a victim anymore. You are the one deciding whether mercy or exposure will be the next move. And as I sat there, the phone lit up with another incoming call from my mother, which I let slide into voicemail, because I wanted her to feel, even for a minute, what it was like to wait in silence for someone else's decision. And the difference was that this time, the decision was mine and mine alone. The morning after I discovered the forged signature, I sat with my coffee and stared at the notary line as if it were a spotlight shining straight into the years of half-truths and manipulations that had always defined my family dynamic. And what struck me most was not even the gall of attaching my name to a legal document without my permission, but the absolute confidence with which they must have done it, as though I would never dare to look closely enough, never ask the right questions, never protect myself, because that had been the story of my life with them. Maya is strong. Maya is independent. Maya will survive even if she is carrying the weight for everyone else. But now the weight was not just unpaid favors or forgotten reimbursements. It was a fraudulent document that could destroy my credit and tether me to a house I never wanted. I drove to the insurance agent's office, calm and businesslike, and requested the notary log tied to that binder. The agent hesitated, tried to brush me off with reassurances that it must be a mistake, but I pressed until the file came out, and there it was, my supposed signature witnessed on a date when I was verifiably at work in another city, logged in, sending emails that could prove my exact location. The notary book showed a neat, false line in black ink, and for the first time, I felt not just anger but a cold certainty that this was no misunderstanding. This was deliberate. When I left that office, I did not cry or scream. I drove straight to a consumer attorney recommended by a colleague. The The consultation was short, clinical, and absolutely clear. The attorney explained that forgery is not a family disagreement, it is a crime, and while plenty of people would urge me to just let it go, the law would not. I told her I was not interested in dragging my parents to court in handcuffs, but I did want a clean separation, a boundary that could never again be ignored, and she said the simplest and most effective way was to draft a demand letter that laid out, in unemotional terms, exactly what needed to happen. That evening, the letter went out on her letterhead, crisp and undeniable. It demanded that my name be removed from every policy, every property, every account to which it had been attached without authorization. It demanded reimbursement for the invoices Avery had ignored, repayment of the so-called temporary bills I had carried for the household, and a signed clause stating that my name and my credit would never again be used for their benefit. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was devastatingly effective because it came with the weight of evidence, the notary log, the forged binder, the identity theft affidavit, and the bank receipts, all attached like anchors they could not cut loose. The reaction was immediate and predictable. My mother called me sobbing, swearing she had no idea how the signature got there, insisting my father must have just signed quickly without realizing, which was ridiculous because nobody accidentally writes my name in perfect cursive. My father tried to reason, telling me that dragging lawyers into family matters was unnecessary, that we could fix it quietly if I would just trust them, and Avery screamed down the phone accusing me of destroying her life over a technicality, as though having my identity stolen was a trivial bump she should not have to suffer for. I listened to each one in turn and answered the same way, I am just taking my name back. That sentence cut deeper than any argument could, because for years my identity had been a tool for them, the one who would co-sign, the one who would cover, the one who would sacrifice, and now I was claiming it like property I had every right to defend. The silence after I repeated it was almost sweet, the kind of silence that comes when someone finally realizes the old tricks no longer work. But the pressure did not end. Within 2 days, the lender's compliance team called me directly, saying they had received notice of discrepancies and wanted to confirm if I wished to file a formal fraud report. They gave me 24 hours to decide, explaining that if I moved forward, they would begin an internal investigation, and the consequences could extend not only to my parents, but also to the notary who had allowed such a document to exist. I hung up and sat there with the phone in my lap, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down. It would have been easy to say yes immediately, to unleash the full force of the system on them, but part of me wanted to hold the knife without plunging it, to make them live with the knowledge that I could expose everything at any moment, and that it was only my restraint keeping them from total ruin. That night I hardly slept, turning over the decision in my head, and when my phone buzzed at midnight with yet another message from Avery, this time accusing me of jealousy, of bitterness, of wanting her house, because I could not build my own, I realized that she still did not understand. It was never about the house, it was about the theft of my autonomy, my independence being used against me, my name becoming their currency. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I was not going to file immediately, not yet. Instead, I would let the demand letter breathe, let them sit in the discomfort of realizing that I held every card, and watch as the panic worked its way through their carefully constructed narrative. They had always cast me as the ungrateful one, the difficult one, but now the truth was written down in documents they could not explain away, and the fear in their voices told me they finally knew it. When my father came to my door that evening, pleading face to face for me to reconsider, I listened quietly, and then I told him that the only thing I wanted was for my name to be mine again. No more bundling, no more discounts, no more forged signatures, no more guilt-tripping about family loyalty. Just my name, separated cleanly from their debts and their schemes. He looked at me as though he had never seen me before, because maybe in his mind I had never been more than the spare pillar he leaned on, and now that pillar had moved out from under him. And as I closed the door, the 24-hour deadline ticking in my mind, I knew that for the first time in years, I was not the one waiting on them to decide what scraps I would be given. They were the ones waiting on me. And that was the kind of power you do not waste. You wield it carefully, deliberately, and only when you are ready to end the game once and for all. When the lender's deadline finally arrived, like a steady hand tapping the table and reminding me that time was not a circle but a line, I had already chosen the path that would either cut everything cleanly or drag us all into a public mess that would leave ash where a family used to stand, and I decided that if I had been forced into the role of the responsible one for this long, I could at least be strategic about the ending, which meant using the leverage I had earned without turning it into a spectacle that would feed their favorite story about me being cruel when in truth I was simply finished being useful on command. The attorney's demand letter had done exactly what it was meant to do, because it took all the heat and drama out of our arguments and replaced them with obligations and consequences, and the silence that followed on their side was not peace. It was calculation, and I could feel them weighing what they might save by conceding in private versus what they would lose if I pulled the pin and filed a formal fraud report that would invite strangers to go through every drawer they had ever slammed shut. By noon, my phone lit up with a group message that included my parents, Avery, and the attorney, and there in the thread were scanned pages bearing real signatures this time, the kind done with stiff hands and clenched jaws. And the documents spelled out terms so plain even my mother's talent for reinterpretation could not twist them into something friendly, because line by line they removed my name from every policy and every account where it had been smuggled. Line by line they agreed to reimburse the quiet debts that had been renamed as favors, and line by line they accepted one clause that mattered more to me than any check, a promise in writing that my name would never again be used for their benefit without my explicit consent. Which is to say that the door they had walked through for years was now bricked up and marked with paint only I could buy. The lender received confirmation from my insurer that the house no longer touched my umbrella policy. The escrow rebalanced at their expense, and the mortgage became exactly what it should have been from the beginning, their monthly responsibility rather than a discount paid for with my identity. And as those pieces snapped into place, I felt the tightness in my shoulders release in a way I had not felt since I was a teenager, signing things I did not understand because I wanted to be seen as helpful, which is another word for available to be used. Avery tried to hold the ground she thought still existed under her feet when she called me with a voice that swam between pleading and scolding, asking whether I would at least unlock the domain so her bookings could restart. And I told her calmly that she would receive the transfer code the moment the payment cleared into the attorney's trust account for the work I had done and the fees I had spent, because the era of invoices being wishes was over, and a few hours later I received the notification that the money had arrived, and I forwarded the code with a short note that said I hoped she would keep better books going forward. Not because I wanted to lecture her, but because I wanted to put the most ordinary sentence in the world at the end of a very long chapter, as if normalcy were a door I might finally choose to open for myself. My mother called to ask whether we could avoid involving the lender's fraud unit now that everything was fixed, and I said we could, because the point was never to injure, it was to separate, and because she needed to hear that mercy is not the same as surrender, and that my restraint was a choice I made for myself rather than a favor I granted to them. When the small claims hearing date appeared on the docket, I did not cancel it on impulse. I waited for the funds to settle and for the signed acknowledgement of services rendered to hit my inbox with a timestamp and a file name I could retrieve in the future without digging. And when that happened, I filed a notice of dismissal without prejudice that read like a door closing gently without locking behind me, and it felt correct, not dramatic, just adult, which might be the most radical thing I have done in this family. The lender's compliance officer sent me a final email asking whether I wished to proceed with a report of suspected forgery, and I replied with a single sentence that said the matter had been resolved privately and that I would not be filing at this time. And I kept the thread, the attachments, and the notary log in a folder named with the kind of clarity that makes future mistakes unlikely, because it turns out that keeping receipts is a form of faith in yourself that pays interest no bank can match. That evening, Aunt Linda stopped by with a thin envelope that she said she had kept for years because she sensed it might matter one day. And inside was a note in my grandfather's careful handwriting telling me that a person's name is worth more than any check, and that I should lend it only to people who would guard it as if it were their own. And I sat at the kitchen table with that note in my hands and realized that I had finally done exactly what he asked, not by being generous without limit, but by drawing a line so bright it could be seen even in the dark stories families tell to excuse the things they take. I did not cry, I did not celebrate, I simply exhaled in a way that sounded like the room had been waiting to hear me breathe for a very long time. When my father called later to say that he hoped we could put this behind us, I told him that I already had, and that what lay behind me was not anger but instruction. A set of rules built from the wreckage of letting other people decide what my boundaries should be, and I said that from now on I would show up to birthdays and weddings and casual Sunday dinners like any ordinary daughter, but I would not finance anyone's shortcuts. I would not be the emergency contact for problems I did not create, and I would not apologize for choosing not to be consumed. He was quiet for a long stretch, and then said he understood, which may not be true, but it was the only sentence he had that could sit in the same room as my choice, and I took it, not as peace, but as clearance to move forward. Before I went to bed, I sent one final message to the lender's compliance address stating that my identity had been removed from all relevant files, and that any future contact of this nature should be treated as unauthorized unless it came directly from me. And then I turned off my phone and stood in the quiet of my apartment, which felt less like a place and more like proof that I had built something of my own that did not wobble when someone else leaned too hard against it. They wanted a house they could show off and call a gift from good parents to a favored child, while I wanted a life that did not require me to keep pretending I was fine with being the foundation no one ever bothered to reinforce, and in the end I chose the life. Not with fireworks or vengeance, but with signatures that said the one thing I had waited years to say with authority and without apology, which is that my name belongs to me, my credit belongs to me, and my future, finally and completely, belongs to me.